Hello, everyone, and welcome to our intersection session titled Translanguaging Practices in EFL, Assets Within the Multilingual Classroom. I myself will be speaking today about enacting transepistemic thinking and ecologies of knowledges in the multilingual classroom. My name is Paul Megan, and I am incoming chair for the TESOL International Bilingual and Multilingual Interests section. Welcome. So an overview of the talk I'll be delivering today, I'll first begin with critical language awareness. What is critical language awareness? I'll then touch on colonial-lingualism and the impacts on multilingual learners in our classrooms. I'll then introduce transepistemic language education and how we can foster greater ecologies of knowledges within our multilingual classrooms. I'll then give you all an example of transepistemics in practice with the example of the Worldviewer class blog that I have implemented in my English as a second and as a foreign language classrooms. I'll then wrap up with some concluding remarks and leave the floor open to you all for the Q&A. I would love to hear your questions and your comments in the chat box once you have viewed not only this video, but all of the videos in our intersection session. Thank you. So who am I? Có Misha. Is Misha Paul Miochan Chiblo? She Gael a Hunnam? Rugag agus Holcha mi on an Glasachu on an Alapa? Sauna ústa dé a ha mi hálach, agus hai nuair an gó a bhí a brín rave. So I introduce myself in my language, which is Gaelic, or in English, Scottish Gaelic. Scottish Gaelic is an endangered Indigenous language in Scotland with approximately 57,000 speakers. I said my name is Paul Megan Chiblo. I am a Scottish Gael. I was born and raised in Glasgow, Scotland. My family is from South Uist. It's in the Outer Hebrides. You'll be able to see this in the maps on the screen. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be speaking with you all today. Now, my research is motivated by the harms of colonization and imperialism on Indigenous languages and speaker communities worldwide. So as I mentioned before, Gaelic, an endangered Indigenous language in Scotland, was not available to me growing up in the education system in Glasgow. There are reasons for this. For example, Gaelic and Gaelic culture were almost eradicated, such as the forced eviction of the Scottish Gaels, the Highlanders, from their homelands and territories during the Highland clearances in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the near destruction of Gaelic clan-based and kin-based ways of knowing and being after the Battle of Culloden by British and Imperial forces in 1746. The Education Act of 1872 also made education synonymous with the English language, and there was zero provision for Scottish Gaelic. And up in the top right here, we can see that one of the first uses of the word colonization in English was to refer to the Scottish Highlanders. As you can see, the colonization of the newly depopulated parts of the Highlands of Scotland by an industrious set of people who, by intermixing with the natives, also known as the Scottish Highlanders and Gaels, may teach them the inestimable advantages arising from diligence and commerce once their eyes have been opened to official happiness. This care was entrusted to the Society for Propagating Christian Knowledge in the Highlands, using their words here, which meantime greatly contribute to the desirable end of reforming and improving the Highlands by erecting schools for introducing the use of the English language and diffusing the true knowledge of the gospel through those regions long benighted by ignorance and superstition. And in more present times, members of my own family recall being beaten for speaking Gaelic in the classrooms, and the multi-generational and psychological impacts of oppression has resulted in the near destruction of community language transmission of Scottish Gaelic, as you can see in the top left of our screen here, the declining numbers of Scottish Gaelic speakers. I have also learned from my Anishinaabe family. I married into an Anishinaabe family and immigrated to Turtle Island, or what is also known as North and Central America, in 2016. And since then, I've learned more about the devastating impacts and ongoing harms of colonization on the indigenous languages and peoples of these lands. So all of these experiences have driven me to think of ways in which we can enact more equitable multilingual education and language policy. So critical language awareness, some of these I speak about my positionality. Languages are affected by power relations, and also ideologies about language, such as which languages have more quote unquote value or quote unquote less value. Language education has been and continues to be weaponized as a colonizing tool, and this has been worldwide. And I gave an example of how the Education Act in the United Kingdom context had detrimental and harmful impacts on the transmission of Scottish Gaelic, an Indigenous language in Scotland. And worldwide, multilingualism, however, was common before colonial and imperial expansion, one nation, one language ideologies, and ideologies of contempt towards Indigenous languages. Due to these ideologies, one nation, one language ideologies, and colonialism and imperialism, studies estimate that one language is quote unquote lost every 1 to 3 months, the majority of which are and will be endangered and Indigenous languages. Systemic, structural, and institutional changes urgently needed to address ongoing tools of colonization, such as colonial lingualism. Colonial lingualism is the privileging of dominant colonial languages, knowledges, and neoliberal valorizations of diversity in both education and policy. Examples in mainstream education, including ESL and EFL classrooms, include monolingual and monocultural learning environments, such as English-only classrooms with white, quote-unquote, native speaker materials, which exclude the peoples and knowledges of local speaker communities and their lands. Decontextualized, disembodied languages, resource languages, code tasks, such as comprehension activities without any cultural context or historical context. Privileging the Western print canon and quote-unquote standard forms of language, such as an imagined and idealized upper middle class homogeneous language. Deprivileging land-based or place-based education and community language definitions, such as visual, oral, translingual, semiotic literacies and repertoires, such as pictographs, body art, standing stones, and dreams as interpretation or acquisition of knowledge. And finally, physical and mental punishment and violence for speaking a heritage, minoritized, or Indigenous language. So, locating and critically reflecting on the worldview, the ideologies we have, the belief and knowledge system through which we language is important. The reasons for this is, for example, English carries a colonial legacy and a human-centered worldview, characterized by linguistic imperialism and cognitive imperialism, human exceptionalism, or the idea that humans are above the rest of nature, and white epistemological supremacy. There is therefore a need to unlearn these processes of cognitive and linguistic imperialism, or what I have mentioned here, an epistemic unlearning process, so that all multilingual and multicultural learners are respected and validated. Epistemic here really focusing on the knowledge systems we perpetuate, either willingly or unwillingly. I propose a heritage language pedagogy, or an HLP, as part of transepistemic language education to action these unlearning processes. What is transepistemics? Transepistemic language education is the act of learning from multiple knowledges to equip both educators and learners with more conceptual tools for sustainable and relational futures. And I'll give some examples of this in the following slides of what I mean by conceptual tools. My conceptualization, however, is important to state of heritage language pedagogy is different to, let's say, mainstream conceptualizations. Heritage language education is not new. However, this conceptualization emphasizes earth-centered learning processes to de-link and move beyond human exceptionalism, the idea that humans are at the top of a pyramid above all of the rest of nature, such as animals, more than humans, such as lands and waters, and to also move beyond individualism. It is also to center and relink the relational connections between languages and place-based knowledges, which, as it stands, are not a primary language objective in many English and world language classrooms. And finally, to engage diverse ecocentric and kincentric knowledge systems, such as those Indigenous and minoritized. For example, the learning of Indigenous place names to highlight multilingualism, translingualism, and multiculturalism that predate colonization. So, heritage language pedagogy, therefore, seeks to problematize uncritical use of dominant colonial languages and universalizing and essentializing knowledge systems. It is important to note that while translanguaging in itself is good and has been normal practice and continues to be normal practice in many speaker communities across the globe, uncritical use of translanguaging could result in language loss and further endanger threatened Indigenous languages, including in English as a second language and foreign language classrooms. For example, the idea to deconstructivist translanguaging, the contention that languages do not exist, has dangerous implications for Indigenous and minoritized languages and peoples already subjected to colonial erasure and genocide. Structural equalities in this bubble of languages not existing can be disregarded, and only dominant nation-state languages and knowledge systems, such as English and Eurocentrism, or a universal Western knowledge system, are quote-unquote valued for assumed linguistic, economic, and or cultural capital. So I have actioned transepistemic education using heritage language pedagogy in my classrooms by including texts created by authors with a non-dominant ecocentric worldview, such as Indigenous authors and creators, alongside texts and workbooks that we already use in the existing curriculum. I implemented this in a post-secondary college English for academic purposes upper intermediate class for international and immigrant students in Toronto, in what is also known as Canada. I created a 5-lesson mini unit where we explored the rhetorical, grammatical, lexical, and cultural aspects of a text and produced an interactive class blog. I named this online multimodal blog an exchange of worldviews space, a world viewer. The world unit I designed formed part of wider English for academic purpose curriculum as part of college requirements, such as academic writing assessments. So the world viewer is an online multimodal and multilingual transepistemic environment. It's an online class blog where learners and educators can share insights from their own worldviews, knowledge systems, heritages, and co-create knowledge in a respectful, non-hierarchical manner. This is the example of the text I used in one case on a module on environment. This text is called Extinction of Indigenous Languages Leads to Loss of Exclusive Knowledge About Medicinal Plants. And this was also linked to an academic publication on the same topic. So students also had the opportunity to look at the text written on an online resource and also an academic publication. And here is an example of the unit itself, where it is divided up here into 6 lessons with a clear text focus, what it meant in terms of blog co-creation activities for group work, and also individual self-reflection work as part of an e-journal. This all led to a blog knowledge co-creation final video response in lesson 6 to demonstrate learner understanding of lesson 1, the rhetorical purpose, the research, the author, the publisher, exploring bias, and activating critical thinking. Lesson 2, analyzing visuals. Lesson 3, analyzing the grammar, of grammar and style. Lesson 4, the lexical component, vocabulary used. And Lesson 5, the cultural aspects. And field-specific terms. Feel free to pause the video or go back to this to look at it more in depth. And then in the final video response, the students could video record. They also had the option to just type it, but many took up the option to video record their responses. Questions included: what are key themes for you in this article? How did the language make you feel? How does the article relate to your experience of languages and language learning? How does the article relate to your experience of language oppression? And do you think that cultural and linguistic diversity is important? And so on. And here's an example of the e-journal, the self-reflection part that students could fill in at the end of each lesson, where they tracked their thoughts and responses over the 6-lesson mini unit. So for example, in lesson 1, how did researching the author and publisher help you in identifying potential bias in the article? So transepistemics in practice, as worldviewers in this example case, we co-created works in English that demonstrated a thorough understanding of the rhetorical, visual, grammatical, lexical, and cultural features of academic texts. We operated at a transepistemic level to add to and complement processes of pedagogical translanguaging. So we're not just looking at linguistic resources here, we're also looking at epistemic resources, such as our knowledge systems that we all carry. So for example, learners shared place and culturally specific concepts in their own languages and knowledge systems, and elaborated on those in English to make deeper meaning with their peers on an epistemic and linguistic level. For example, I myself, as an educator, shared the concept dúchas, which is a Scottish Gaelic concept. It's a millennia old, thousands of years old concept, which stresses the interconnectedness between people, the land, nature, and an interconnectedness between humans and more than humans. Dúchas itself, the root word dú, meaning earth or land as well. And other students gave some examples of concepts and language use in their context, such as a learner from Turkey sharing they had whistled languages there, a learner from Mexico sharing how chocolato is the original hot chocolate drink and originated in Mayan culture. These insights and experiences stimulated further knowledge sharing and co-creation and embodied an ecology of knowledges in our classroom about whistled languages across the globe and ecologically sustainable Mayan cacao cultivation. So there was also links to sustainable practices, traditional ecological knowledge. In sum, heritage language pedagogy acknowledges the existence of and accommodates insights from all languages, majority, minoritized, nonverbal, such as sign, and indigenous, and their associated knowledge systems, since languages do not exist in vacuums. So in conclusion, transepistemics or transepistemic language education through knowledge sharing and co-creation activates an epistemic unlearning of harmful dominant mental models and assumptions, such as cognitive and linguistic imperialism and human exceptionalism, or the view that humans are superior to the rest of nature. Heritage language pedagogy as transepistemic praxis, so theory in practice, is proposed as a way as TESOL educators, ESL, EAP, EFL educators, and learners can raise critical language awareness, address ongoing tools of colonization such as colonial lingualism, and foster ecologies of knowledges in the multilingual classroom. And here is where you can find more details on the publications and the sources I've referenced. Here, for example, is Transepistemic Language Education for Sustainable Futures, published in ELT Journal. The QR code here will take you to the publication itself and a link to download the PDF should you wish to read more. It also has the mini unit that I discussed as well in there. So it's great for practitioners looking to bring in transepistemics and foster ecologies of knowledge in the English and multilingual classroom. Colonial lingualism, similarly, you can find more details about what this term is, colonial legacies, imperial mindsets, and inequitable practices in English language education. Similarly, there's a QR code that takes you to the open access publication and PDF that you can download and read. And finally, I thought this might be a useful resource as well, a chapter publication in a handbook of multilingual TESOL in practice titled Online Worldview Language Spaces, OWLS, Integrating Decolonizing Technology and Heritage Language Pedagogy in TESOL. QR code will take you to the chapter, and this also talks about the mini unit and the ideas I referenced in the talk. Finally, I'd like to say Morantang, thank you for listening, and please do feel free to write in comments and any questions in the chat box. I hope you enjoyed this talk and also enjoyed the talks as part of our intersection session. Tapalev, thank you again. Goodbye.